Evening all, welcome along to the first in our Demystifying Woodland Management sessions. Thank you all for joining, thanks for saying hi in the chat, lots of you from all over the place. Do feel free to use the chat throughout the session, ping any questions that way, we'll gather them all up. We've got two short Q&A sessions where we'll stop and do all of that. My name's Kath, this is Jez, and without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Neville from Cumbria Woodlands for a bit of an intro.
Excellent. Thanks ever so much, Kath, Jez. Welcome to everybody. Cumbria Woodlands is a not-for-profit. We've been around for 30 years now, celebrating our 30th year. We're here to advise, guide, train and support both owners and those working within the sector. What struck me watching the dress rehearsal last week was this is where Springwatch really meets woody stuff. So I hadn't quite sorted out in my head whether Jez was a little bit more like Lollo or Chris Packham. So perhaps we can have a vote on that by the end of the evening. That's kind of my big to do, really. We've had huge interest in this. We've had 300 odd delegates, and we've done almost no promotion. So it really just illustrates to me just the depth of interest in woodlands, woodland management at the moment. Cumbria Woodlands is exploring, trying, playing in this space of communicating with people. We really want to develop our learning, our engagement and knowledge within both the sector and those that are keen to get into the sector and just those that want to find out more. So your feedback around how we do this, the balance between this, face-to-face and other delivery vehicles is really, really welcome. Last 2 points from me are cherishing what we have, absolutely vital. Looking after woodlands before we start creating new ones has to be the place to be. So I'm really, really pleased that so many people are interested in looking after those special places that we already have. Finally, just a quick word to say thanks ever so much to our sponsors. Without them, this really couldn't have happened. So thanks ever so much to everybody at Forestry Commission England, especially to Mike and Ian. So if you're out there, hello, and I'll hand back to Jez and Catherine. Good luck. Hope you enjoy this evening.
Thanks, Neville. Good evening, everyone. I'm Jez. Kath has gone off momentarily because apparently everyone in the chat is more better company than me. It is a real pleasure to see so many people here. We've been pretty much blown away by the number of people who have signed up for this and who have come onto YouTube, and we're really looking forward to doing it and spending the next few Thursday evenings with you. It's been exciting, a challenge, hugely educational to prepare these courses, and we hope it's as interesting for you and as challenging as well as it's been for us. So the way these courses are going to run is every Thursday evening, 7 till 8:30, and it's going to be a mixture of me and Kath talking to you. We've got loads of fantastic video. If you get bored of listening to us, then quite frankly, mute the video and have a meditative hour watching Alice's pretty amazing video footage that we've taken over the last few weeks. In each session, we'll have a Q&A session somewhere in the middle and at the end as well. So loads of time for Q&A. Put your questions in the chat and Kath or I, whoever's not talking, will compile them and we'll go through them. So there's 5 sessions, and tonight's session is going to be, we're going to cover the basics. We're going to right back to what a woodland is, and we'll sort of move on from there. Session 2 next week, we're going to look at how to monitor a woodland. What does a healthy woodland look like? What does good timber look like? If you go for a walk, how do you know, how can you tell how that woodland is changing over the time? And in the 3rd week, we're going to get into some proper silviculture. Silviculture is a word we're going to use a lot in this course, and it's the art and science of growing trees, and that's going to be session 3. And session 4, we're going to look at all the other stuff, the sort of ecosystem services, we sometimes call it, the soil health, the air, the water, all of that kind of thing. And then session 5, we're going to finish off looking at products and services, and we're going to look at further training and where to go and all of those kind of things. So let's just do, before we get into some much nicer video than looking at me, let's just look at a bit of history, I guess, and why we're doing this course now. We were pretty stoked when Neville at Cumbria Woodlands approached us about doing it, because there's a real resurgence in wood culture and woodland culture, and the number of people using forests, owning forests, being interested, and it just felt a right time to just ask a really seemingly stupid question for us professionals who are in it every day of, well, what the hell is forest management? Why do trees need managing? And that's why we're running the course now, if you like. And people want to know about trees. Increasingly, it's in the news. Increasingly, we're having debates in the media about reforestation and deforestation and the best way to manage woods, carbon and timber in buildings, all of this kind of thing. And it's important, I think, yeah, without wanting to go on too long, let's take a second just to look at the history of woodland in this country. And what better place to start than actually where we're sitting right now. And we are in Plymouth, in a part of Plymouth called Estover, which may seem completely inconsequential, but Estover is the right signed in the Charter of the Forests with the Magna Carta to collect firewood. It was the right of all of us common citizens to go into woodlands to collect firewood and wood for repairs to our houses. And the Charter of the Forests was signed because people were losing the right to go into and use the woodland. And of course, there was a lot more woodland back then, and it provided all of our materials, all of our food, all of our water, virtually everything that we existed on. It was sort of the plastic and oil industry of the day. And since then, we've gone through a roller coaster of deforestation and afforestation in this country. And that includes, at the beginning of the 20th century, the huge Sitka spruce plantations that we're all familiar with. And then in the sort of 80s, a resurgence of a more conservation, naturalistic approach to woodlands and woodland management. And now I think we are entering a time of, rather than being at extremes, of finding a middle way to woodland management that is both sustainable and resilient and productive, that's biodiverse but also providing for society. And these are some of the things that we're going to explore over the next few weeks. And we're going to explore things about the time length that it takes. A lot of what we're going to talk about is things, woodland management that we do today that none of us will see the repercussions of. It'll be for our grandchildren and our great-grandchildren. But if we don't understand woodland management today, we can't make those good decisions for the future. And so without further ado, we're going to start the session by really asking a basic question about actually what is the value of woodland. So let's go to some video and let's have a look at the value of woodland. Before we even start to look at even simple elements like what a woodland is or types of woodland, before we can understand how we're going to manage a woodland, then we have to start by understanding why that woodland is important and why it's important to you, to society, to biodiversity, to the people that use it. If we don't understand the value, and the values we place on the woodland, then it's going to be impossible to manage it in a moral or ethical way. So let's just take a moment to have a look at what these different values are that we might hold in a woodland. And the first and probably most important, of course, is the biodiversity in that woodland. And this biodiversity is something that I think as foresters that we have to admit we sometimes ignored the value of in the distant past, but which now is something that is recognised as perhaps the most valuable part of a woodland. It defines how we manage a woodland. It defines how well trees grow. It defines how we aesthetically view a woodland, whether we think it's in good health or bad health. That biodiversity value is increasingly important to us. But actually, we probably shouldn't be so arrogant as to think of that biodiversity value in terms of ourselves. Actually, the value is in the ecosystems that inhabit it. What value do the ants, the mycorrhizal fungi, the otters in the water, or the birds that use the canopy of the woodlands placed on that woodland? If we can make a woodland more valuable to them and work symbiotically to create a rich biodiverse woodland, then we're probably going a long way to create a sustainable and resilient woodland. And then we can move out from the woodland itself and look at the entire landscape and the place of trees and forests within that. And part of this is about an aesthetic value placed on the landscape. If we go to a protected landscape, a national park or an AOMB, then we have an expectation of what that landscape is going to look like. And there's an obvious economic impact on that landscape of people wanting to go to somewhere they see as beautiful. But there's a much greater and richer landscape value to woodland. And that might be in the way that we create networks of woodlands. So we're creating a network that connects big woodlands to smaller woodlands through hedgerows or through agroforestry systems. And these matrices start to form in a landscape. Or it may be that within that landscape, actually, what we're interested in is our journey through a woodland from, say, the dark depths of a woodland into the light and into a more agricultural or even urban setting. And then we should probably not forget that landscape isn't some big natural view from the top of the hill. It isn't necessarily some huge vista, but we get micro landscapes within the woodland itself, and how those micro landscapes play out, that transition from, say, a broadleaf to a conifer woodland, or from oak to birch to perhaps another species, or the vertical landscape from the ground flora up to the canopy, all hold individual values. And those values are not just in our aesthetic appreciation of it, but perhaps in the biodiversity and also the economics as well, which takes us on to the most obvious economic value we associate with forests, and especially commercial forests, and that is the timber value. And let's not ignore this. You may have come to this course from the point of view of being tied to wanting more native woodland. You may have come to this course because you enjoy walking in a large conifer plantation. Either way, you can't ignore the need from society for more and more timber, whether that's for building with, whether it's for bioenergy, whether it's for agricultural fencing, for a whole world of uses. You have to remember that in the past, timber was the plastic of the time. It was the material that was used for everything, and it looks like once again that is going to come about, and that's going to increase our need for timber. And so it doesn't really matter whether you're looking at a native ancient woodland or a conifer plantation. You should still somehow recognise that there perhaps has to be some element of timber value within that. And the same's true of all that non-timber stuff that we get from a woodland. And this has sort of largely been ignored in the past probably few decades. But let's look back to the Middle Ages and even the 18th and 19th century, where very large proportion of a commoner's food, our food, would have come from the forest, whether that was through deer hunting, whether it was through the collection of nuts and berries, and of insulating material in the mosses that come from the forest floor. The forest was a provider of life, and as forests retreated, of course, they became associated with the origins of the water that came down the river and these wild places. And these non-timber products sort of got left by the by as agriculture took a hold, but are now starting to become important again in a lot of ways, especially when we look at, for instance, agroforestry systems, where suddenly we can see how trees and crops can not just live side by side, but enhance each other. And in just the same way as agroforestry systems match trees and crops, actually, whilst many of us have been foraging on a small scale in woodlands for blueberries or fungi or nuts, this is becoming increasingly common. And there is a value in the woodland that we perhaps need to reassess in how they can provide sustainable and resilient food sources for the future. And that's all very well to look above the ground and the trees and the landscape and everything we can see before us. We're kind of obsessed with placing visual value on stuff. What about the ground below our feet? The soils themselves have a huge value, not just to the trees and the life that grows on them, but also to things like water and what happens downstream and in lower areas to us. But the land also has a financial value as well, and let's not forget that the freehold value of forestry is actually an incredibly important value that many buyers of woodland place on it, and is a primary reason often for buying into woodland in the first place. You know, even for those of us that might want to buy a small area of beautiful woodland or something we might want to own, actually what we're buying into is the freehold value of that. And there's, in most of our eyes, as a secondary objective to just wanting to have a piece of woodland, is the increasing value of that freehold. And so let's just sort of back up a bit and say we can divide the value of a forest really into two. There is the sort of standing biomass, the value of the timber and the value of the products, the value of the ecosystem services and the wildlife within it. And then there is the value of the ground, the freehold value. And that freehold value, or the freehold and above ground value combined, is pretty amazing in how over the last 20 to 30 years it has been by far the best performing asset class in land values. As much as house prices have increased, they've not increased nearly as much as land value of forest has. We could go into the reasons for this forever, but it's got to be an important part of how we manage the land. It's got to be something we consider when we consider how we're going to manage it. And then, of course, finally in this section on value is the personal value we place on a woodland as we walk through it. It's almost that visual amenity value. How beautiful does it look in our eyes? Does that indicate how well managed it is? Does it give us pleasure to know that it is well managed? And as we'll go deeper into this course, the other important question we'll ask is whether that's actually important. When we come to look at rivers, for instance, in session 4, we're going to discuss how messy watercourses are often much better than something we might consider attractive from an amenity point of view and very tidy. And so, just to close this section off, we need to think about the value of woodland. We need to think about how those values and interactions of those values come into play as we move on to look at how to actually manage a woodland. And so when we started the course, we were looking at what we wanted to cover, especially in this first session, and we sort of toyed with the idea of, do we do a section on types of woodland? Is it a bit patronising? Everyone knows what a broadleaf woodland is and what a conifer woodland is. It's not that difficult. Surely that's a bit basic, primary school stuff. So we sort of shoved it aside a bit. And then we started filming in the woods. And as we went through and we started looking around us, it was sort of, we found ourselves wandering through different types of woodland, and it really became apparent that the way we talk about woodlands and types of woodlands is actually incredibly complicated. Suddenly there were so many ways of talking about the woodland we were in. It's, oh, well, this is a steep woodland, or this is a flat woodland, or more often than not in Devon, this is a boggy woodland. Or, is it a broadleaf woodland? And it just started to be more and more complicated. And so we thought about putting this section back in on types of woodland. And then once we decided to put it in, we started thinking about the geography and the communities and the type of people that use woodland. And this huge matrix of almost semantics. It's about not just what is physically in the woodland, but the words we use to describe it. And how can we carry on with this course? How can we talk about woodland management if we don't talk about types of woodlands? And so for the next few minutes, although it might seem very obvious, we're going to start covering types of woodland and break them down into a whole load of different areas, and that'll give us the basis to start talking about management and management planning. So you can have a break from my face but not my voice for a moment as we head on back into the woodlands. Let's start with the woodland type that everyone associates with the kind of place they want to be. These broadleaf woodlands, we very often give them the term native woodland, but let's think of them as a particular tree type. These deciduous trees, these oak or beech or ash that constitute what was at one time almost all of England's land cover and are now in generally small fragmented groups. And we can tell these woodland types just because of the species within them and the habitats that inhabit them. beech woodland with the tall, straight trees, oak woodlands, sometimes gnarly and twisted, sometimes us plantations, or these young birch woodlands that maybe naturally are the start of a long succession of woodland types, or maybe even planted as birch for biomass, for instance. And then we've got conifer woodlands. We associate these with the plantations of the 1940s and 50s, serried ranks of spruce marching across hillsides, green all year round because they're not going to lose their needles, except for perhaps the larches that are becoming increasingly rare in this country. And we have a very fixed visual image of these conifer woodlands. And then of course we've got mixed woodlands, and we'll probably talk quite a lot about mixed woodlands in these sessions because they're becoming increasingly common. And these are woodlands where perhaps there is some broadleaf element, some conifer element. In most conifer woodlands now you get some broadleaves, and that they may be as small compartments, or they might be on the edges of forests, or it might be an intimate mixture of trees all mixed together. And then we can look at a different type of woodland, or we can typify them in a different way, perhaps by the history of management. And the history will account for what a woodland looks like now. And so we have these woodlands that we call ancient semi-natural woodlands. And these are woodlands that are little changed from the last couple of millennia almost. They're broadleaf woodlands that have a mix of tree species and other flora and fauna that are very typical of what we think a natural woodland is. They might have had some management, it might have been little, it could even be plantations, but they're ancient semi-natural. And then we have plantations on ancient woodland sites. And these are a lot of, certainly in England, the conifer plantations, or even remember oak plantations that are planted on what was once ancient semi-natural woodland. So there's been a continuous succession of woodland on this site. It's just that its management has become more human orientated. But in the ground, in the soils, there is still those remnants of ancient woodland habitats. And of course we can then break that down a bit further. So we can talk about what is native woodland or non-native woodland by typologies. And it's sometimes, it's very obvious. We can say this oak woodland is native and this conifer woodland is non-native. But what about everything in between that? And so we have this idea of nativeness that we assign a date to and say everything that was here before this is native and things that came in after are non-native, and we'll discuss as we go on how climate change might affect that. But let's look at, say, sweet chestnut or beech or possibly sycamore that we would naturally put into this types of woodland that are broadleaf and perhaps nativeness and native woodlands, yet they're actually introduced species in the same way that conifers are. And we need to decide when we're talking about types of woodland how we deal with that. And then if we're going to look at a final type of woodland by its history of management, then let's look at completely unmanaged woodland. And there's very few of this around. There is a couple of remnants in Cumbria. There's Wisman's Wood on Dartmoor and a couple of other small woodlands, but these are incredibly fragmented. And we actually know very little about these woodlands, other than the fact that they've almost certainly seen no human intervention in them, yet still exist in our landscape. And that's pretty amazing that these remnants are still around, and perhaps a question of how us as custodians of the landscape deal with these incredibly rare remnants. Then we can type woodlands by perhaps where they are. Are they upland woodlands, or are they lowland woodlands? Upland woodlands tend to be typified these days by large blocks of conifer plantations. Think of Kildare, or think of Grisdale, the Forestry Commission's big plantings of the 40s and 50s, and this extends all the way down to the south to places like Dartmoor, where the spruce was planted on peatland because that was felt to be the best place for it, and actually it grows incredibly well. And we can also club into this upland planting a lot of shelter belt planting, where we see farmers putting in either slim or broad lines, generally of conifers, to protect the lower quality farmland, perhaps in the valleys. And we can also look at lowland planting. We can look at broadleaf woodlands, perhaps in deep valleys, lots of southern England. Think of the sweet chestnut in the southeast, and perhaps mixed conifer, broadleaf, continuous cover type woodlands that are quite common now in the southern England. Or we could say, well, what about this woodland near a river? Let's call that riparian woodland, and it can be very old, ancient, semi-natural woodland, or it could be newly planted woodland, but because it's by a river, we type it as a riparian woodland. And then finally, we can typify a woodland by its current management, by its silviculture. And silviculture is going to be a word we're going to use a lot during this course, the art and science of growing trees, and actually we can use it to typify or give names to types of woodlands. So we could call a woodland a plantation. This is a woodland that has been deliberately planted, where the species has been selected, very often in a grid pattern, but not always. And you have to remember there's ancient plantations of oak planted for our navy and for house building hundreds of years ago, and the plantations we're used to, the conifer plantations. Or we could call a woodland an agroforestry system, where it's planted intimately mixed with crops or animals on a farm. Or we could call it an urban forestry system, where it's planted in a city. Or we could have a rewilding system, where perhaps there's either no management or a move towards no silviculture in that woodland at all. And so I think the point is to try and get across that you think it's easy to give a woodland a type, but actually it's incredibly complicated, and you can divide it in many ways. And this follows through to how we're going to look at managing woodland, where there's so many crossovers, not just in woodland types, but in the management approaches for those. So out of the corner of my eye, I can see Kath waving at me, asking you all to put some questions. We've got a Q&A session apparently coming up in a few minutes. But before we do that, it's yet more of me. This session appears to, Kath seems to have got out of a lot of this session. We'll be getting her in future sessions for a lot more of this. I don't feel like I've been put upon. We're going to talk about types of management now, and it's sort of, I suppose, getting slightly further into the nitty-gritty of it all. And as this session goes on, I think that's sort of the way it's running. We're going to start basic, and we're going to go on into slightly more complex and more complex and more complex. So after the Q&A, we're going to start looking at standards and sustainability and certification. But for now, let's take a look at some video of some of the different types of management that you might see in a woodland. And these types of management, combined with types of woodland and the idea of what your values in a woodland start to generate what we're going to look at later in terms of objectives and management planning. So let's go back to some video. So the first thing to note is that types of management are often completely mixed up. It's actually pretty rare to go into a woodland and just see one type of management or one type of silviculture. And so this sort of layered complexity of woodland management we're already starting to see happening. And the most obvious type of management we see in most of the woodlands, what we think of as a woodland, a forest, is of course what we call high forest. And we call it high forest because, well, there's big high trees in it. It's pretty much as simple as that. Big high trees are high forest. And of course, it's worth bearing in mind that tiny little young trees that are going to be growing into those big trees are also high forest. And this is the sort of, I suppose, platonic ideal of a forest. And that high forest can be in a number of different forms, a number of different management types. So the most common type of high forest, I guess, is plantations, and those conifer plantations or those oak plantations, or what we look at as plantations on ancient woodland sites, or even unmanaged woods with fully grown trees in, we'd call all of these high forests. And even if we have natural regeneration underneath them, we'd still talk to them as high forests, call them high forests, traditional forests, if you like. And then another traditional form of forestry is coppices. And coppice is the act of taking a tree, normally a fairly young tree, almost but not always exclusively broadleaf trees, and cutting them when they're at, say, 10 years old, and letting those established root bases regenerate as coppice stools with multiple shoots on them. And these coppice systems have been a very traditional way of managing woodlands since well before the Industrial Revolution, but really came of age during that Industrial Revolution, when large volumes of small diameter material were needed for charcoal making, for fences, for a whole load of other uses. And this sort of coppice system was quite industrial, and I think it's worth bearing in mind that this is a harsh system sometimes of large areas of coppice, almost like an agricultural crop. And it's usually they were interspersed with standards with big trees, and we'd call that a coppice with standard system. And it sort of went out of favour at the end of the Industrial Revolution as we got more technologically advanced, needed less charcoal or less bark for leather tanning. Then these coppice systems went out of favour. But now, of course, we're seeing a very large resurgence in them, and that's largely based on the biodiversity value of these woodland systems. And having coppice with standards holds huge amounts of habitats and allows large amounts of different types of ecosystems to exist in a very small space. And these coppice with standard systems lead us quite naturally onto what we call short rotation forestry today. And short rotation forestry is really just the modern form of coppice with standard systems. And it's a way of growing biomass quickly. But rather than using, say, oak, then we generally use species today that have almost been hybridized to grow incredibly fast. And that could be, say, hybridized Sitka spruce. It could be eucalyptus grown for bioenergy. But it also could be broadleaf species as well. And so Birch is very often grown in these short rotation forestry systems, and it's the act of planting trees very close together, growing them very quickly for a short amount of time, maybe as little as 5 years, and then harvesting them usually for bioenergy. And it's, I suppose, one of those systems that's quite attractive to farmers because it is an almost agricultural system. It's very easy to see it as a crop. So we've looked at high forest and coppice with standard and short rotation forestry. We can mix all these together now into a very modern system of forestry that we call continuous cover forestry. And this is a type of system that almost encapsulates elements of all the other management systems into one. And the starting point is to say, I want a forest where there is continuous canopy cover. So unlike a plantation where you grow it up for maybe 50 years and then clear fell the whole lot, so you've got a big area devoid of trees, then plant all the trees again and grow them up and fell them. And unlike a coppice system where there might be no canopy at all, because actually what you end up with is very large bushes of coppice stools, and unlike a short rotation forestry system that is almost an agricultural crop, we're going to say this land is going to be woodland forever, and it's going to have a woodland canopy over it forever. Now there might be gaps that form in that canopy, but it's about creating a complex and intimate mixture of species and ages within a woodland, and it's very often seen today as a particularly resilient, sustainable type of forestry. The best way of thinking about it is as a complex three-dimensional matrix of species and ages in a woodland. And we'll look at these in a lot more detail as we go further through the course. But it might be that you're just taking out a single tree here and a single tree there, or it might be that you're taking out a small group here and a small group there. And it sort of very much alters the dynamics of the woodland management and also the economics of how those woodlands are managed. And then finally, I suppose, let's talk about some fringe types of management, I guess. And there's always some discussion about these, almost even whether they're actually forestry systems, but we are quite passionately believe that orchards and agroforestry and rewilding systems are actually, proper, real, considered silvicultural systems. And orchards, of course, are very old, very traditional way of managing trees. A lot of the time we don't think of them as woodlands, but hell, why not? They are just wide space trees. They're not intended to produce timber. Their intention obviously is to produce fruit or nuts, but these trees and the tree management is still a considered woodland system. And the same goes for agroforestry, which is just a modern form of orchards in a way. And this is growing trees in amongst agricultural crops or animal systems, and it can be wood pasture, another ancient type of woodland now reinvented for the modern age, or it can be what we call silvo-arable systems where trees are planted in rows between crops. And again, we'll look at these in a little bit more detail as the course goes on. And finally, let's think about rewilding, because although it's sort of the purest form of rewilding is to say, let's not touch this area of land. Actually, most rewilding systems need some form of management to get them from managed to rewilded. And actually in their rewilded state, as we'll see as we go on, almost always need some kind of continuous management.
Thank you everyone for getting involved with the chat. Loads of really, really good questions coming in. This is just a short Q&A. Any that we don't pick up now, we're going to pick up at the end. So we'll kick off. There's a really good one here, Jez, that is coming from Daniel Brown, asking if you should look to restore woodland back to how it used to be, or should you just accept how it is and try and keep it healthy?
Oof, thanks for picking an easy one to start with.
You're welcome. You're very welcome.
Great.
Over to you.
Should we restore woodland back? I suppose the question is, how was it? What are you restoring it back to? Are you going to pick a point in history that you think it was like? We'll go on to cover this, but almost every woodland in the UK has had some form of management. And so actually finding a point to restore it back to, I think, is difficult. And what we're going to look at through the course is how to ensure that your woodland is healthy now and resilient for the future, which I think is probably more important way of looking at it than restoring it to a point in the past. That's probably a bit slopey shouldered, isn't it?
Okay.
Let's go with that.
Yeah, enough for now. Another good question coming in was from Rob M. Is there an easy way to identify pores? So that's plantation on ancient woodland sites.
Oh, yes. So session 2 especially, we are going to cover pores, these plantations on ancient woodland sites and ancient semi-natural woodland and the differences between them. But I think what I'd say, probably slightly controversial personal point of view, is every ancient semi-natural woodland is a plantation on ancient woodland site. I mean, there's been so much selection over the centuries on wood type and tree type that they're almost all plantations. But we'll look at this in a lot more detail.
Okay, great. So that's in sessions coming up.
Yes, incentive to turn up next time.
Yeah, nice. keep them enticed.
Yeah.
And then Mountain Pig is asking, how do we work with existing woodland management managers like the Woodland Trust and county councils when their work is seeking to link more forest networks with their smaller sites?
Oh, good question. I think that this is probably something we'll look at a little bit in right at the end in session 5 about sort of networks, and also as we're looking at management planning. But people like Cumbria Woodlands, who I've been involved with, known them for decades, and Sylvanus Trust down here in Southwest when it existed, and people like Reforesting Scotland, these woodland initiatives and charities I found are by far the best way of connecting people together. So providing almost a sort of independent point of reference, the people that can talk the same language as a woodland owner and talk the same language as a county council. And that's a pretty rare thing to find, people that can do that and want to do that. We keep plugging on with woodland initiatives and finding ways to connect people together, especially with the county councils and the Woodland Trust. And the Woodland Trust are getting way more involved now with private owners than they ever used to be. But it's still something we, as a whole sector, need to work on better, I think, this connection. And it's something we need to find new ways of working on. I guess it ain't perfect, but
what is?
Yeah.
So we've got a couple minutes left for the Q&A. Leslie Elkins is asking about ash dieback, and just, do you know if there's healthy regen in Cumbria on that front?
So yes, this is going to be the answer to a lot of questions today. We're going to cover this in.
Just quickly write it in.
Yeah. Session 2 and session 4 especially will cover ash dieback in a lot more detail. If people don't know, surely most people know. Ash dieback is killing huge amounts of ash all over the country. It's a disease that's spread through the country incredibly fast, and certainly down here in Devon it is rife everywhere. But occasionally you come across stands that are completely dead but with really healthy, really healthy ash in it. And it's a case of taking samples of that and sending it off. And there's actually a scheme to do that. And we'll get details for you actually for the next session, because it is quite important if you have healthy ash to send it off. And what was the rest of that question before I go on for the next hour?
They're just
about
wondering, about in Cumbria specifically, is the healthy regen there, healthy regeneration?
We'll find out from Neville for you.
Neville knows.
We're stuck in Devon. We're stuck in Devon.
And then before we have to wrap it up, any book recommendations you want to throw out there?
Ooh.
People have been in the chat recommending books already, so they've done half the work for you, but if you could chime in as well.
Oh man, thousands. I just got yesterday a copy of Esmond Harris's book on oak, which I am really looking forward to getting stuck into at the weekend.
Nice.
It's on the history and growing of quality oak. From a woodland management perspective, Chris Starr's book on woodland management is really good as a practical guide. Oliver Rackham on history. Perhaps we'll put together a book list actually.
That's a
that would
nice
be,
idea.
I'd love to do that.
That's going to be a long list, isn't
It's
it?
going to be a long list.
Good luck, everyone.
Yeah. And then, of course, when we started university, I think the whole class was pretty much marched down to the bookshop to compulsory purchase Cyril Hart's great tome on forest management. And if you're getting, I still reach for it today. And if you're getting seriously into woodland and forest management, it's well worth seeking out.
Excellent. I think that covers the questions we've got time for now. So,
excellent. Thanks for those, Kath.
That's
You
all
pick
right.
some easier ones next
You're
time.
welcome.
That'll be perfect. We're going to really start layering on levels of complexity, having started with woodland types and sort of eased everyone into this. We're going to start looking at woodland objectives now. So this is deciding what's important in a woodland to you. And it might be your woodland, it might be a woodland you walk through. You might have no influence on it, but it's still important to think about what you think the objectives of this woodland should be. Or it might be the woodland over a whole catchment, or even over the whole country. And why not be involved in national woodland and forestry objectives? You know, we are all citizens of the country. We all use woodlands, and actually we should all have a say in how our forests and woodlands are managed. And we can see that quite clearly when we look at past management. And I suppose what we've tried to get across so far is sort of the complexity of woodlands, of the types of woodlands and values in woodlands. What this course is really going to do is sort of challenge you in a way of looking at it, woodland as a really complex matrix, and then sort of drawing back a bit and saying, well, let's break that apart a bit and see how we can work within that complexity to find management. And objectives are sort of just the same way of doing that. And you know, what we're going to look at in a couple of minutes through some video is different areas of management. I think what's absolutely critical from my point of view is that we don't take single focus approaches to management. This is something we've done in the past, and it's never been particularly successful, and we can see that in the conifer plantations that we've already mentioned. You know, after the last war in the early 20th century, we had a single focus: plant trees for a strategic reserve of timber. Nothing else mattered, really. Biodiversity didn't matter, soils didn't matter, nothing else mattered. We need to get timber in the ground and growing, that's it. And then there's a whole other side, which is pure conservation forestry and woodland, where there is nothing else that matters than a single focus. And sometimes that's as much as saying, we are going to manage this woodland for a particular species. And sometimes that doesn't work as well either. You invest so much time and effort into that one species at the expense of perhaps other species or timber or access or the local community. And when we're looking at objectives, I think it's important to realise that in these list of things we're going to have a look at, to decide not just what interests you, but what the priorities of this woodland and you and the community are. So let's go and have a look via some more video at possible woodland objectives. First of all, let's look at biodiversity, because, you know, no matter what all your other objectives and priorities might be in managing a woodland, then the biodiversity is a key factor in how resilient and sustainable a woodland is. You know, timber production, say, might be your primary focus, but biodiversity then has to be a really close second, because without this biodiversity, then we're left with a dead woodland. Even the trees themselves are part of that biodiverse system. And so it should always be one of the top focuses, one of the top objectives of the management of any woodland. And then we can look at timber, and timber is a management objective we associate with a great many woodlands we see. You know, us foresters, we devote a lot of time to the objective of timber production, but as woodland users, that might not always seem the priority in a woodland, or the amount of time and attention we focus on this objective might not always seem apparent. And this timber production objective for many owners is the complete priority, but we're coming to realise it can't be done to the exclusion of everything else, and the biodiversity and the communities that use the woodland are also incredibly important. But for many, timber is still a priority, and that is because we have a saying in forestry that I think still holds true, that the wood that pays is the wood that stays. And actually, generating an income from a woodland is one of the surest ways to ensure that it is going to carry on being resilient. If there's no money to put into managing for better, healthier, more biodiverse soils and forests, then it's not going to be managed for that. And by producing some timber, we can help to pay for some of those management objectives that perhaps don't produce any income themselves. And we can move on from timber, and associated with that income potential, I suppose, is a woodland objective that is around amenity use. And by that, the woodland objective might be that you as an owner might just want to walk around it on an evening with your dogs and feel the peace and tranquility of that private space. But amenity can also mean allowing people onto the woodland, whether that be informal access, such as footpaths and informal parking, and just being pleased that local people are using a local woodland. Or it could be the development of trail centres for mountain bikes. It could be accommodation on a forestry site for holiday makers. It could be running events. And this amenity objective is a pretty huge area of management. And again, a lot of the time we try and combine that objective with possibly a timber objective, and almost certainly with a biodiversity objective. So just because you have cabins in your woodlands, actually what that means is you might have to, that might be the primary objective, is to run a forest holidays operation in this woodland. But actually what that means is that your biodiversity objectives have to be pushed further up the priority list to compensate for the ground and land taken up with the accommodation. And then we have what we might call natural capital or ecosystem service objectives. So these are objectives that are of use to society that might not be primarily the most useful thing it seems to do with your woodland. And as a classic example, let's think about water here. And so the way water runs through a woodland is incredibly important. It can help ameliorate flooding further downstream. It can help reduce soil erosion. But the way the water runs through the woods sometimes needs to be controlled to protect tracks and paths. And for a lot of people, especially on the banks of big rivers and estuaries, actually that natural capital approach of providing a service to those downstream by planting woodlands on a floodplain might be the absolute priority in the woodland objectives for that woodland. And we'll go on to look through the course as a whole other series of things, these natural capital objectives like carbon, for instance, or air quality, or shelter for microclimate. And talking of shelter, this brings us on to a whole other type of woodland objective, in that the objective of the woodland might not be the trees itself. They might be providing a function outside of the forest, for instance, as shelter for animals, for livestock, for shelter for crops. And these sort of shelter belt systems are incredibly common, especially in the uplands, where you have thin lines or groups of trees that provide shelter for fields or houses. And so in this case, the woodland objective, the management objective of the woodland, isn't necessarily about the trees themselves or even the biodiversity in them, but the biodiversity and the people and the products outside of them. And then there's a whole area of management objectives which absolutely can't be ignored, that are a core part of the rural community, and that's in the management of game, whether that be for deer hunts or pheasant shooting or whatever it may be. In some areas of the country, this is the primary objective of woodland management. And in some areas it might not be the primary objective, but it's certainly a secondary or tertiary objective, because often these types of management for, say, pheasant shoots bring in more money to the woodland than actually the timber value or any other value of the woodland, and help pay for the sustainable and resilient management of that woodland. And again, these are factors that we'll think about as we go through the course, and we want to try and give a broader perspective as possible on the potential management objectives and approaches to a woodland. And then finally in this section, let's look quickly at community woodland. And community woodland is a woodland management objective in itself. Some woodlands are planted purely for the community. Some are bought pre-existing as a community asset. And suddenly this is a objective that totally integrates the local community into all the other objectives, whether it be biodiversity or timber or amenity or water or whatever it is. Suddenly community woodland becomes a management objective itself. And that is sadly, for the moment, enough video apparently. We thought we'd sort of ration it out a bit, and we're now going to start to look at woodland standards and taking everything we've talked about this evening, all the values of woodland, the objectives, the types of woodland, and what does that start to mean in how we approach sustainability and standards in forestry. And this can sometimes feel a bit dry, but I find it incredibly interesting. We can look at what standards mean and what standards there are and what government standards there are out there, and we'll look at that in a minute. But actually this whole idea of sustainability and resilience is absolutely core these days, and we need to find a way of defining it almost if we are going to be adding into our management planning and our management plans an idea of sustainability. What do we actually mean by that? And everyone has a different attitude to what sustainability and resilience means. I really like, when we were out filming, we took out Mike Gardner, a local sawmiller, and we'll be hearing from him quite a lot in future episodes. But he put it really nicely and really convincingly, saying, you know, the thing about forestry is that you have to pretend you're immortal. Now, I don't think anyone wants me to be immortal particularly, but what he was trying to say was, when we take an action in the woodlands now, you know, we need to take it in a way that acknowledges that we're never going to see the results of that. You know, we might do for some fast-growing species, for instance, but actually what he was getting at was not the very practical management, but the idea that when we decide on our woodland objectives and our sustainability criteria, we're asking not what is important for us today, but what will be important for our grandchildren and great-grandchildren in 50 or 100 years' time. And I find that hugely exhilarating and nerve-wracking. And it's one of the most exciting parts of the job, when we think about what species we're going to plant. How do we go about that? You know, who are we actually planting it for? And so that's all very well, and everyone will have their own ideas, but we need some framework to put sustainability and resilience into, and we need to prove to other people that what we're doing is sustainable and resilient. And the only way to do that is within legal and voluntary frameworks. You know, like everything else in life, it comes down to a bit of form filling, which is almost ripping the soul out of something that's so important and so personal and so vital to society. But that's kind of how it is. And so we're going to start this session and we're going to take a look at some of these sustainability criteria and some of the legal frameworks that exist to help us prove to other people that what we're doing is at the very least legal and at the very best completely sustainable and resilient. So let's have a look at, let's go to the computer. And the first thing to look at is what we call the UK Forestry Standard. And this is a document that governs what the government and the Forestry Commission believes are sustainability standards. These are the very core things you should be doing in your woodland, the core objectives, the core woodland types and the core legislation and conventions that you need to put in place if you want to legally manage your woodland. And that's backed up by a much more detailed document called the UK Woodland Assurance Standard. And in some ways, this provides the same approach, but in a lot more detail about how you're going to manage your woodland. And if you want to get something like FSC or PEFC certification, that is a standard certificate of sustainable good management, then the UK Forestry Standard as a minimum and the UK Woodland Assurance Standard are the things that you have to follow. It's a very useful and easy framework to make sure that what you're doing is to the conventionally approved way of doing things. And we can see that it covers things in quite a lot of detail, down to the, for example here, we've got how do you deal with the brash that comes off a harvesting site, or how forest roads are constructed, how all these procedures take place. And once you've got this in place, then you're most of the way to proving sustainability in your woodland. And we can see here in the biodiversity section, We've got how low impact systems should be managed. Here we're looking at how veteran trees should be managed. So freeing from shading and pollarding of younger trees, and we'll look at all of these types of techniques that are contained in the UK Woodland Assurance Scheme as we go through the course. And here we are in one of the two main certification schemes, and these are voluntary schemes, in this case the Forest Stewardship Council. These are the main schemes that give you voluntary certification. Think of it as the equivalent of an organic status in a farm. Forest Stewardship Council and also PEFC is the other major one, and they're both very similar in a way in that they're both aligned to the UK Woodland Assurance Standard and forestry standards, and have some extra criteria and follow a paper chain that allows you to say to people who are buying your timber that this is certified. And then there's other voluntary schemes that are more localized. For instance, Grown in Britain is not just about how sustainably managed your woodland is, but saying to users of your timber that it's not just about the sustainability and resilience of the woodland, but about the fact that the carbon miles stay in this country. Finally this evening, we are going to finish off, and I'm sure everyone will be glad to have heard the last of me for a while, for a week at least. We're going to start looking at management plans and what a management plan is. And I think it's important at this early stage of the course to think about it, because every woodland kind of needs a management plan. And in some ways you can look at it, people look at it a bit of bureaucracy that has to be done, but the actual act of writing down what you want to do to a woodland is hugely important. It's and you can look at a management plan for a woodland in a whole number of different ways. You know, you can, when we were at university, we were sort of, marched into the library and told to spend 3 weeks writing a voluminous management plan that considered everything in huge, great detail. And that's very nice luxury to have. A lot of people don't have that. And even if it's just writing a list of priorities or objectives or thoughts on a woodland, every time you come back in from a woodland, just writing down what you've discovered, what you think, all of that can be part of a management plan. I mean, your management plan can be a written document, it can be a video, you can dance it on TikTok if you want. It doesn't matter. It's about saying to the world, this is how I'm going to manage my forest and my woodland, and putting your mark down and say, this is what I believe is sustainable, and this is what I believe is resilient, and this is how it fits into the frameworks that prove that. But there's we're going to finish off tonight by looking at actually the Forestry Commission's management plan template, because it provides, I suppose, a very good introduction to management planning, because it covers everything in the basic enough detail that you need to get an approved management plan. So let's go back to the computer and have a look what the Forestry Commission's management plan template looks like. So here we are on the website of .gov.uk looking at the Woodland Management Plan, and this will walk you through everything you need to know and do to create that management plan. So we'll cover a lot of this as we go through the course, but one of the things it does is gives you some examples of completed management plans, and we can start to look at these. And this one, obviously they're made up, but it covers everything that we've talked about in terms of designations, what standards and consultations you need in a woodland. They cover what your vision of the woodland is, almost those values we started to look at the start, of what your objectives are in the woodland. And then they ask you how and when you're going to achieve those. And what the biodiversity is in a woodland, any protected species and priority species, and these are things you might know or might get from an ecologist. They talk about the archaeology and the landscape, the people, the water and the habitats. Everything we've sort of talked about around this evening and we'll look at in much more detail in the future. Then it'll start to ask you about what protection there is in place, about plant health, which we'll cover in future parts of the course, water and soil, and any environmental implications of what's going to go on in your woodlands. And these boxes are actually quite short and it's quite quick to fill these in. Section on your management strategy here. So this is talking about the objectives, how those objectives are going to come out in actual work in the woodland. And then final sections of this start to talk about how you've engaged the local community and stakeholders and what work proposals are going to take place and how you're going to monitor these. And it seems like quite a lot in here, but actually it's pretty simple once you start breaking it down. But it's something that you should really think about getting an expert involved with, because not only will they know the procedural way of doing this and what is most likely to be successful and approved, but they will have the silvicultural knowledge to make sure that it meets your priorities.
And as if by magic, they've let me back. So we're going to do the next section of the Q&A. So I hope you're ready, Jez. I've chosen some really nice ones.
Bring it on.
I like this. This is a good game. Okay, so Fraser Burley was asking about mixed species woodlands and was commenting on them providing ecologically healthy environments, the fact that they appear to be sort of the best for our current ecological concerns. He's asking, how do we combine timber production with mixed species woodland?
Yeah, good question.
Thank you, Fraser.
Let's, I mean, this is a subject out of my own heart. I totally see why people plant monocultural plantations for, say, the production of large volumes of timber. Personally, I find really interesting the idea that we can use mixed species woodlands to both produce timber and have ecologically vibrant woodlands and most importantly, really healthy soils. And it's something that's expanding a lot at the moment. It's what we sometimes call continuous cover forestry, where there's a mixture of species and ages in the woodlands. And we're going to be looking at, I think in session 3, when we're looking at silviculture, we're going to be looking at these different types of woodlands in quite a lot of detail, but especially we're going to be looking at mixed species and mixed age woodlands, because I just think it's, for me, and especially down here in southern England, the way.
Nice, that's something to look forward to. I like that you're just drip feeding all this stuff as well, so people
It all
come back.
happens later.
And then Andy Minister is asking about, when looking to thin out unmanaged woodland, what influences decision making there on what to thin?
Oh yes, another teaser then. Yeah. We've got a big section on thinning coming up in session 3, I think. But in a number, so it's almost, well, it will be unmanaged woodland, but it depends on so many things. It depends on what the trees look like, how thin and tall they are, how stable they are, what the soils are like, how windy it is. Thinning practice is an art, and we'll look at different thinning practices. But what I'll say now, because I think it's important to what we've talked about this session, it's about knowing your woodland, and actually it's about being able to make a judgment based on your knowledge, rather than just being dropped into a site and saying, well, Cyril Hart says in his book on woodland management that we should be doing a line thinning every 5th row here. It's about saying, well, this is what's happened in the past on the site, and this is what's made trees fall down or not made trees fall down, and perhaps we'll do a bit of a soft touch thin in a bit of an area and see how it works out. Being able to take that long-term approach to woodlands is really important, and especially in sort of thinning practice of unmanaged woodlands, because it's so delicate. The implications for getting it wrong are you lose the whole woodland, but the implications for getting it right to soil health and ecology are just so huge.
Great, that's another thing to look forward to then. So next question we had was more of a comment. So this is a good one. Leslie Elkins was saying, she made a comment on the resilience of woodland, the natural resilience of woodland, saying that, actually is all that we have to do is to stop preventing them from being resilient.
So let me get this right.
Yeah.
Can we just shut the gates and leave?
Leave them to it, maybe.
Maybe.
They're naturally resilient anyway. Can we just let them alone?
I was having a discussion with someone at the Woodland Trust about this just last week. And it's an experiment that I don't think has really been done that much. Even at places like NEP, so-called rewilding, require quite intensive management approaches. People are still going in. I think there's places like Ennerdale where there's really large experiments going on. But who knows? Wouldn't it be great to just completely close off a woodland? I suspect that our management of these woodlands has been ongoing for so long that things like species and tree selection, I imagine if you go into an ancient oak woodland, those oaks have been selected for the last 4,000 or 5,000 years. And so we don't know what that's done to genetic diversity, and nor do we know what the effect of changing climate is going to be. So although we could sort of close the gate and say we're not going to intervene at all, we are actually intervening in the state of the climate and what might happen in the future. But again, something we're going to cover. Our scientific knowledge of sort of woodland processes is so poor, really, because they're all so long term. That it's really exciting that we can research this and understand the level of complexity now, but also a bit frightening how little we actually do understand at the moment.
Can you comment a bit more on what's happening at Ennerdale for anyone who's not familiar?
We're going to cover that. Stock answer, isn't it? I mean, no one has any idea whether we are or we aren't,
Quickly
but we are now.
Next week. Okay, so we can leave that for a minute.
Yeah.
We can park it. Okay, great. And then Laurie Parks was asking if you've got any pointers on bringing people a bit more to the middle ground, so away from those extremes of timber production and ecological value. What's that middle space look like?
Oh, more people talking about it, I think. It is super difficult. I spend a lot of time teaching architects and architectural students, and one of the things we discuss is who has the primacy of decision making, the timber user or the timber grower. In the past it's been the timber user, but perhaps now it should be the timber grower, and we end up having these discussions with architectural practices as well. It would be amazing to have these discussions within the timber sector with commercial volume timber growers and conservation foresters, to be able to rationally discuss where that middle ground is something I completely aspire to doing. I think it's where we've got to be. But it's a discussion that's happening, maybe in its infancy, but we have to find that middle way somehow to be really resilient.
We've had a follow-up question from Clementine Lehmans. Sorry to anyone whose name I've mispronounced, by the way. I mean, I should have said that at the top. Similar to Ash Dieback, she's wondering what your point of view is on reintroducing sort of selected resistant elms.
Bring it on. I mean, I think at the risk of annoying Neville at Cumbria Woodlands, I have a bit of a laissez-faire attitude to species introduction and nativeness, and I think looking to the future, native is just this weird word we use. But yeah, hell, why not? Same with Ash. Use science to create resilience and sustainable landscapes. why the hell not?
Excellent. That is pretty much it. I've scanned through. Anyone shout now if you've got any last minute questions. But yeah, I think that's it for questions for today, Jez. You
Awesome.
escaped lightly there, I think.
Do you think?
Yes.
Well, I'm not so sure.
More difficult questions next week, please, everyone.
Yes, because we'll be swapping around. I'll keep asking the questions. Thank you all for listening in tonight. It's been a real adventure for us to put this series together and to get the first one under our belts. I think it's been fantastic. We are blown away by the number of people that have subscribed and have joined in. It would be great over the weeks to increase the numbers even further if everyone can just tell one other person. And I think I'm right in saying if you've registered through Cumbria Woodlands, you will have all the links, but we will publish the links to the YouTube channel on the day next Thursday for anyone that hasn't registered. If you want them all now, register. And we're hoping, I think, to try and live stream on Facebook next week as well. Part of this project is about innovation, and basically we'll just try innovating up to the point where we break everything and then get off for a pint. I would just like to finish the session by saying thank you to Cumbria Woodlands for giving us this chance to do it. Thanks for Kath here for asking difficult questions. We're going to be hearing a lot more from Kath in the coming weeks, as well as a load of other people we've roped in to talk to us from the woods that we've recorded as well. Thanks to Gareth hiding in the back there, who is providing all the tech from the Creative Engagement Group, because without them, it's fair to say, Alice and I have spent a fair few days with our head in our hands trying to work out the tech for this, and who would have thought it? It's slightly more difficult than you think. And then finally, Alice Carfrey, who I think is linked below, along with all the other links to all the websites we've used today for all the filming. It's been fantastic to be out with her, filming in the woods, turning her into a woodland geek, but producing some amazing footage, we hope. And over the next 5 weeks, that'll continue on. Hope to see you all next week. Have a great evening and a great weekend. And bye for now.
See you soon. Bye, everyone.